We'll kind of get started here. Good morning, everyone. I'm looking at the list of attendee names here and seeing lots of friendly names. Wish I could see your faces, but glad that we are all here together, physically distancing, but socially still together, still participating in all these different kinds of activities. And I think what's going to be a really great presentation today from Sarah Wrightsman, who is uh, Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to ensure that local and statewide policies are favorable. Oh gosh, I just lost the bio. Let me bring that over. She is Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to ensure that local and statewide policies are favorable to the development of financially feasible workforce housing in the Seacoast region of New Hampshire and southern Maine. Wrightsman also serves as the housing planner for the Regional Economic Development Center. Recently, Wrightsman was selected for the 40 under 40 class of 2020. Wrightsman was also named to New Hampshire Magazine's 2019 IT List and a 2019 10 to Watch winner by Seacoast Media Group and Catapult Seacoast, and the 2018 Civic Leader of the Year by Stay Work Play New Hampshire and New Hampshire Public Radio. Sarah is a graduate of Leadership Seacoast class of 2019. She is also a graduate of the University of New Hampshire and has a master's degree in public policy from the Carsey School of Public Policy, and we are very proud. During her graduate studies, Wrightsman served as a fellow for New Hampshire Listens, which is a civic engagement initiative out of UNH. Wrightsman is also the co-host of Creative Guts, a podcast focused on the pursuit of creativity. Wrightsman lives in Durham, New Hampshire with her husband Aaron and her rabbit Luna, and we are so thrilled to have her here today to talk with us about public policy and community engagement. Welcome.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks to everyone for being here this morning. I am going to share my screen. So I have my PowerPoint up. All right, so I am going to be talking today about community engagement and public policy, the relationship between those two things. I'd encourage you, whenever you have questions, to drop them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. We'll be checking that throughout. Maybe we'll pause to answer some questions during the presentation. Otherwise, I'll get all of them answered at the end. So as Jordan said, I'm the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast and the Housing Planner for the Regional Economic Development Center. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the Workforce Housing Coalition. We're not a developer, we don't develop housing, and we don't do direct client service, i.e. like finding housing for folks. Instead, our mission is to promote housing affordability, supply, and diversity. This is through, community engagement, it's through advocacy, it's through education, providing technical assistance to municipalities. So our primary goal is working with changing land use regulations at the local level. So our strategies, we recognize that each community needs a tailored solution. So our work is very sort of one-on-one with municipalities. We have 60 or so communities in our catchment area, and we're able to, choose a few priority communities every year and work one-on-one with them. For larger communities and cities, we're going to emphasize density and affordability and talk about inclusionary zoning. For smaller communities, we might emphasize the diversity and supply parts of our mission more, emphasizing missing middle housing and including accessory dwelling units. So that's just a little bit about what we do. Our work falls into these three buckets of policy, process, and attitudes. Policy being changing zoning, process being looking at the barrier that's created by the approval process at the local level, or barriers that are created in the approval process, and attitudes being the biggest thing that we do, which is changing people's perceptions and misperceptions and addressing the myths about workforce housing shared by both, local decision makers and by members of the community. So you probably know the acronym NIMBY, not in my backyard. There's also bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, CAVE, citizens against virtually everything, and neighbors. This is a new one and albeit more subtle, neighbors who say nay to everything. So a lot of our work is sort of fighting up against this opposition, both empowering YIMBYs, the opposite, the yes in my backyard folks, and also working to engage and try to get at some of the myths and the messaging that's being perpetuated by folks who are on the other side of this issue, the NIMBYs, bananas, caves, and neighbors. So I'm not going to give you a ton about the housing crisis for a couple of reasons. If you are familiar with the headlines, and I assume that most of you have heard to some extent or the other that New Hampshire has a housing crisis. Our supply is incredibly low. The rental side, our vacancy rate is very low. On the for sale side, particularly starter homes, those under $300,000, the supply is incredibly low. And that, there our median gross rent, our sale price continues to go up and is unaffordable for many members of the workforce. So I'll give you New Hampshire Housing and these two publications that are sort of their most up-to-date housing data if you wanted to take a look at that. I don't want to equip you with more data than you need going into this. You don't have to be an expert to be an advocate, and you don't have to be an expert to be part of this conversation and part of the solution. The other thing is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I don't know at this point what that means for our housing stock, and none of us really know exactly what's going to happen. So we do know at the end of this, we're probably still going to need more housing for the folks who live and work here, particularly the folks who are still at work right now, like healthcare workers and those working, in our grocery stores. So I don't want to equip you with more than you need to know, because what you really need to know is that when we're talking about workforce housing, we really are talking about housing for members of the workforce. As much as we don't always love the term workforce housing, it is an incredibly appropriate, well thought out term for this type of housing. It's literally housing for members of the workforce. And so when you're thinking about what that housing is, really think about the members of your workforce who works in your community. Where do you live? Who works there? Even in the smallest communities, you probably have some municipal staff, school teachers, firefighters, police officers. I'm in Durham right now, so I'm thinking about the folks who work at the University of New Hampshire. I'm thinking about the folks who own little small mom and pop shops that are suffering right now in downtown Durham, and part of what makes it charming. Thinking about the folks who work at the post office, the schools, the libraries, et cetera. And so think to yourself, who are the folks who work in my community? Can they afford to live here? So for most communities, the answer is no. And if it is, it means that, workforce housing is an issue that your community has. And I'll also tell you just a little bit about the workforce housing law to give you a little background on this issue. So New Hampshire RSA 674/58-61. New Hampshire's workforce housing law was adopted in 2008. It is intentionally vague and flexible. It requires that communities have reasonable and realistic opportunities for the development of workforce housing. Keywords there being reasonable and realistic. So if you have a workforce housing ordinance in your community and it's not reasonable or realistic, meaning that a developer can't reasonably and realistically use this to create a financially feasible project, that it's not in compliance with the workforce housing law. And so it's really stressing the point that every community has to be part of the solution, because housing is a regional issue, and so every community is part of the region and therefore has to be part of the solution. The workforce housing law also gave us definitions about what workforce housing is to help guide these conversations. So it's for sale housing that's affordable to people making up to 100% of the area median income, and rental housing affordable to people making up to 60% of the area median income. Affordable just meaning that they're not spending more than 30% of their income on their housing. You can get how that translates to numbers from New Hampshire Housing. They have the 2020 workforce housing and purchase and rent limits just came out. So those are available if you want to see how that translates to numbers. The other thing I want to give you, and I tried to drop it in the chat box, but I guess you can't do documents on webinars, is the Workforce Housing Coalition's fact sheet. It basically addresses the top 9 myths about workforce housing. So I only give you this because I think it's important to know the arguments that you're going to hear against workforce housing. as you, start to work on this work in your community, these are the things that you're going to hear from the NIMBYs, the bananas, the caves, the neighbors saying about workforce housing. Each of these is going to be available on our website with, citations and links so that you can do some more research about it. We're also releasing them one at a time through our newsletter. We call it the Myth of the Month. And so the first one's already out. You'll be able to see the rest of them if you're on our newsletter list. If not, I can help you get signed up. So you'll be able to see the data that backs up each of these sort of facts on the fact sheet. But again, I only give you all of that so that you have sort of a baseline of here are the basic things that you need to know. You really, like I said, do not need to be an expert to be an advocate. You do not need to be an expert to be part of the solution. So the bulk of this presentation about engagement, not just sort of what it is, but also how we do it and how we use it and why it matters in our work. So I can't possibly do this presentation without saying thanks to the folks who have really taught me everything that I, know about engagement to this day, both, my experience working for the University of New Hampshire when I was a student at the Thompson School and I was working with Kate Hansen in the Community Leadership Program, to later when I worked at the University of New Hampshire for New Hampshire Listens. When I was at the Kersey School, I was a graduate fellow with New Hampshire Listens and trained in their process. I got to spend a year working with Bruce and Michelle very closely. And so a huge thank you to them. I've learned a lot about community engagement from them specifically when I was getting my master's. To George Regan at New Hampshire Housing, he's the community engagement manager, and he's really stressed this as a value in our work. Engaging the community is an incredibly important part of achieving our mission of promoting housing affordability. And of course, to Molly Donovan, who is sort of the queen of community engagement at Cooperative Extension, also at UNH. So I guess there's a lot of UNH shout outs in this particular slide. So before I get into sort of what is engagement, I think it's important to understand the 4 basic types of government in New Hampshire so that you have an understanding of who your decision maker is and how. And I'm going to be using the planning board as an example a lot. I'm going to be using sort of council and select board as an example a lot, and I'm going to be using zoning ordinance amendments a lot. But it's important to know this regardless of what your issue is and what policy you're trying to get changed. That if you're working on the local level, it's good to know how that process happens. So the first type of government, the strong mayor and board of aldermen. An elected CEO runs the city. That's the mayor. This is really just Manchester and Nashua, and I have very little experience working with this particular type of government. An elected body of representatives set the policy. That's your board of aldermen. I assume, decision maker wise and how the process flows, it's probably very similar to the next type of government, which is the council and manager government. So an elected legislative body runs the city or town. That's your city or town council. The head of the council kind of serves as a figurehead for the community. That's either a mayor or a council chair. My personal experience is that it seems a lot less true in particularly smaller towns where the council chair isn't really seen as a figurehead in the community. Council hires the professional CEO to run the community. So that's if you have a city or town manager or a town administrator. 11 cities and 7 towns in the state have this form of government. I'm very familiar with this form of government from working through these forms of government, but also through my role in Durham on the planning board and sort of seeing it happen firsthand. So the decision maker in this form of government, the planning board gets a say and votes to send it off to council. So if you have a zoning ordinance amendment that's going through planning board, it'll go through planning board. They get to discuss it and tweak it and do whatever they need to it and then send it off to council. The residents have a say in this type of government too, not just because they vote for council members and planning board members in towns where that's an elected position. In a lot of communities, it's an appointed position. I'm told in more communities, it's an elected position. But they also have a say from showing up at public hearings. What you say at a public hearing is incredibly impactful and has a huge influence on the community. So then the last 2 types of government are both sort of select board, SB2 or the traditional town meeting. So they both have a select board, which serves as their governing body. They can appoint a town manager or a town administrator. The only difference between them is that in an SB2 town, you have a separate deliberative session and town election day versus in a traditional town meeting town, you have to be at the town meeting to vote that day. So the deliberative session and the election are combined. So, the rest of the state falls into these two categories. And in both of these categories, the decision maker is the planning board. It's the planning board that works on a zoning ordinance amendment and sends it to the warrant, and then the voters vote on it. So the voters are incredibly important in these communities. So it's your community engagement strategy in a select board community is going to be incredibly important. So no matter how great your zoning ordinance is, if the voters don't vote on it, it doesn't really matter. So types of engagement. First, I'll sort of start by defining engagement versus outreach. So engagement is basically any time that there's two-way communication versus outreach is one-way communication. So you can think of outreach as more like promotion or advertising. Outreach would be sort of flyers, press releases, anything where you're putting it out to the community. They're not having an opportunity to respond. Versus engagement, you'll often hear sort of listening sessions, very much what New Hampshire Listens does, surveys, key informant interviews, focus groups, anything where you're getting feedback from the community, and that feedback that you're getting from the community when you're engaging them is both beneficial to them, they're learning something from you and sort of hearing your take, but they're also having an opportunity to influence policy, which is very important, and influence the recommendations that are going to be made. So there's thin and thick engagement, thin engagement being meet the community where they are. So making it easier for community members to engage by bringing the engagement opportunities to them. And I have some examples of this on the next slide that we've used in our work. So doing surveys is a good way to get folks that you just sort of would otherwise never get because they're not going, out and participating in the way that other folks are. Surveys should never be your only method of engagement. We always include it as a supplemental method, though. Doing poster boards and dot voting is really great. This is when you set up a poster board at, say, like the town hall, for example, or the post office, or some place where you anticipate lots of people going. If you can get it at like a Dunkin' Donuts or all the local coffee shop, that's a great way to do it. And giving people an opportunity to write on the poster board, responding to a question or voting for things that they like or whatever your objective is there. Working through local community groups and local institutions, like working through the schools is really great if you can get in there. Working through other community groups, if you have like a chamber of commerce or a business community group that you can talk to. And then thick engagement is probably what most of us think of, sort of initially picture when we think about engagement. It's when you have the community come to you. So having something like listening sessions is a great example. Sort of what New Hampshire Listens does is an example of thick engagement. Have the community come to you for a structured and organized conversation in some way or another. So some examples of thin engagement. The dot voting here was an advocacy training that we did last February in Exeter, where we had people identify what were the top barriers to advocacy for them by putting a dot on the board. And the other picture was in Rochester's City Hall. We put out a board before and during our Rochester housing workshop, asking people to just say, picturing the future of housing in Rochester, what is it that you want to see? So we were able to collect feedback from people who were just going in and out of City Hall throughout the weeks leading up to the charrette. So it's a good way to get input from people who you might not be able to get input from because they're not the people who are going to show up at a listening session necessarily, or they're not the people who are able to show up at a listening session. So I wanted to include a slide on engagement versus advocacy versus education. And this is the Workforce Housing Coalition's like three major sort of buckets that we work in: engagement, advocacy, and education. And for me, at least, and as a result of the work that we do, these things are incredibly murky. And is engagement and advocacy synonymous? Technically, no, but kind of. And so thinking about in these blue boxes here are examples of advocacy, how to be an advocate. And a lot of them are one way. You're either emailing or calling your legislators or your local council members, your select board members, and letting them know what you think. Letter to the editor is certainly one way. Testifying is an incredibly important example of advocacy, but is certainly one way. Attending an event or posting on social media could arguably open up some opportunities for engagement. People are responding to it, again, submitting a formal letter, a lot like testifying. But when I think about my favorite example of engagement, or my favorite example rather of advocacy, it's incredibly engaging. And so I wanted to include this as an example. So I have bolded coffee. And for those of you who are, very literal, we're not obviously talking literally about having coffee, although you can absolutely literally have coffee. But any way where you're meeting with a local leader or a decision maker one on one, again, maybe over a cup of coffee, maybe not, but having a one-on-one conversation with them. And I think about sort of this example of advocacy provides an opportunity for you to offer a little bit of education. It provides an opportunity, more importantly, for you to hear from them and from what it is that they say. It's a good opportunity, especially if you're doing engagement work in a community that you don't know super well. So doing a charrette in Durham for me, where I live, versus doing a charrette in, say, Pelham, that I had never heard of until it was time to do a charrette there, is two totally different things. And having coffee or meeting one-on-one with the local leader is a great way to learn a little bit of the history of that community. And so thinking about that, it's an awful lot like a key informant interview. And so is it advocacy? Yes. Is it education? Yes. Is it engagement? Also, yes. So are those things technically synonymous? No, but yes. And I'll talk a little bit more about, our process at the local level once we've identified um, a priority community that we're going to work with. Once we've started that partnership, what does our work look like? So that's our roadmap to change, and it'll give you a good idea, and I'll spend a little time on this slide. It'll give you a good idea of what we do. So once we pick a priority community, and I might use Durham as an example a lot because we are working with them right now in partnership with a UNH class, the Community and Environmental Planning Capstone class, CEP 777, is working with the Workforce Housing Coalition to look at Durham's housing supply and think about ways to promote housing supply and affordability and diversity in the town of Durham. So specifically addressing what Durham desperately needs, because it's what Durham doesn't have, which is housing for, non-student young professional folks. I often joke that I'm the only, non-student person under 40 who lives in Durham, which of course isn't actually true, but feels it sometimes when we're talking about sort of our permanent residents versus our, non-permanent or seasonal student residents. So I might use Durham as an example a lot for that reason. So our first step is to provide some education. It's a good opportunity for us to provide baseline education, but is also a good opportunity for us to hear from the community and sort of get an idea of where are we starting? Where's our starting line? What's sort of the baseline education here? What are the initial arguments that are going to come out against workforce housing? And so in Durham, this started a year and a half ago or so, and I gave a presentation to the Economic Development Committee. I gave a presentation to the Town Council, and I gave a presentation to the Durham Business Association. And so this was an opportunity for me to meet sort of the key players. It was also an opportunity for me to set out some foundational baseline education. But it was also an opportunity for them to start asking their initial questions and for me to get sort of their first impressions. So that's a great place to start once we pick a community to work with. The second thing we're going to do is connect. So collect the community's people infrastructure. And I literally mean, who are the municipal staff and what's their take on this issue? And who are the decision makers? Who are the elected leaders, the elected officials? Who are the business leaders? Who are the other sort of key influential people? Most communities have some very influential residents who are involved in anything. And that is pure engagement, because it's a lot like having coffee with a local decision maker. And it's a lot like a key informant interview where I'm meeting with folks one on one or in small groups and getting their take on the issue and connecting with them and building some sort of foundational relationship that will guide the rest of this process. So then I pause to collect some data and really get an idea of what I'm looking at. What is the housing stock like? What is the demographics like? The economic composition, sort of what is this community like? And so that's really for me and for the Workforce Housing Coalition to get a real look at what this community is dealing with, and helps to inform future engagement and future education. Um, and so then again, engaging the community, except this is much more direct engagement. We're, doing surveys, we're doing focus groups and listening sessions and events and key informant interviews, but we're also doing, thin engagement, putting, the dot voting and the posters up wherever. In Durham, we did a survey that was incredibly well received. And one of the great things about Durham versus other communities that we've worked with is that we have robust media in the area. So we have Seacoast Online, Seacoast Media Group, rather, which runs Seacoast Online and has this great way to reach a ton of people and get responses from a ton of people. In other communities we've worked with, there isn't that sort of, ability to reach a lot of people. The other thing that Durham has sort of along the same lines is the Friday updates, which is an email from the town administrator from the town hall that goes out to thousands of residents every week. And so getting survey responses in this community was really easy, and getting people just sort of aware of what we were doing. Ultimately, we do this engagement because when you get to the end of this process, you don't want anybody to be surprised by what's happening, or you don't want anybody to say that this is the first time that they're hearing about it. And so then we can provide some more tailored education. At this point, we've already provided some foundational, some sort of initial education. We've connected with people. We've got an idea of what the community is dealing with. We've engaged, the greater community and talked to residents. So now we sort of have an idea of where this community's at, what's their starting line, and what do they need to understand better or differently. And so now it's time for some tailored communication. Education that is tailored specifically to sort of where they are. And then at this point, and this is, our sort of charrette days, the design days, what people think of when they think of the word charrette, is this ability to draft some recommendations, providing municipal staff with some tailored recommendations to their community. Now, incredibly importantly, is some feedback loops in here. So we draft these recommendations, and that's great, but then we need to bring these recommendations to the community and make sure that they understand it, engage them about the recommendations specifically, and provide some education to them. So once we do that, we then go and edit our recommendations, and that feedback loop continues until we feel really comfortable with the recommendations that we have. Does the community seem to understand it? Do they seem supportive of it? Are these recommendations right for this community? And then finally, once we have some final recommendations, we can do some more advocacy work, which is a lot of community engagement. Again, so if we see this as the process of we've turned over our recommendations to the planning board at, step 6 and 7, we're getting to step 8. We want the planning board to pass these recommendations, either to send them to council in the first 2 forms of government, the city kind of government, or we want the planning board to put it on the warrant for the voters to vote on. So whichever our sort of outcome is, depending on where we're working. So Durham is a town council form of government. We want our planning board to, take a stab at, or oftentimes in Durham, I found that zoning originates with council and then goes to planning board and then goes back to council, and that's fine too. So we want our decision makers to pass it on to the next body of government. So there's a lot of advocacy required there. The residents are incredibly important because there are public hearings there. So there are opportunities for them to either, yay or nay, or, give their blessing to this zoning change. And in the select board types of government, we're talking about voters going out and voting on it either the day of town meeting or the day of town elections. So there's a lot of education and advocacy needed at step 8, so that on voting day, you're not surprised by the outcomes. So some of our sort of engagement philosophies, most important thing is that the community owns whatever it is that we're doing. So the Workforce Housing Coalition could hypothetically go into a community and say, this case study, whatever, this solution that worked in Minneapolis, Minnesota is great. So just do this and like that's it. But you really need the community to not just understand what you're doing, understand the solutions, but they need to own the solutions. They need to feel like they were part of crafting the solutions. And so it's important to have them be involved with the process as early as possible. The earlier that you have the community involved, and the first thing that we do is put together a like group of community members, usually with the help of municipal staff or local leaders, is put together a group of like people who you can meet with on a regular basis to help to plan this work. And so creating a shared vision to lead the work right from the get-go is incredibly important for them owning it, for them supporting it, for them understanding it. Understanding that every community is unique and their solutions should be too. So there's a range of housing types. Workforce housing is not just apartment buildings, which is one of the facts that's on the fact sheet. Workforce housing is not just apartment buildings. It encompasses a range of housing because ultimately workforce housing is just housing. It's regular housing for regular people, and that includes a whole bunch of things, including single family homes and everything in between that and apartment buildings. So again, if you've done your job well, you won't be surprised when it's time for the vote or the decision day. You'll and I have plenty of stories about times that we didn't do our job well enough. And as a result, when it was time for the decision to be made or time for the vote, we were surprised by what happened, or a a NIMBY group. In the case of one community I've worked with recently, a NIMBY group came out of the woodwork toward the end of the process with a whole bunch of scary messages that they were spreading on a secret Facebook group that none of us were privy to because, one, I don't live there, so they wouldn't let me in, but also that they were only letting people who agreed with them into this Facebook group. So they had this huge resident Facebook group of people who were, the NIMBYs, Caves, Bananas neighbors. And it was tough to hear that so close to the finish line, where this sort of came out of the woodwork and they were really like actively campaigning against workforce housing and against the solutions that we had drafted. Um, it happens though, and I sometimes joke that if YIMBYs were as sort of aggressive in their strategies, that we might not be in a housing crisis in the first place. But the question being, did YIMBYs really want to operate that way? And the answer is no, we really don't. So don't ignore, but do dilute the feedback from the NIMBYs at all. Um, Obviously, so you send out a survey, and the folks who are not in support of housing are going to fill out the survey, and that's totally okay. You put a board up in the town hall, and it's totally okay. The naysayers are going to engage, and they have to be part of that engagement strategy. But it's great when you have the opportunities to sort of dilute their feedback. So is there enough positive to outweigh this negative? And it's helpful in keeping that sort of segment of the population whose minds you're never going to change. So that's definitely not a strategy we recommend. You're not going to change the minds of the NIMBYs more likely than not. But if you can show them that there are enough other people, in support of it, that their power isn't as powerful because it's not as concentrated, then that's a great way to handle that. And keeping in mind that engaging communities grows our capacity. So I said the Workforce Housing Coalition works in 60 or so communities across the Seacoast region. We really work all the way from Nashua to Kennebunkport, Maine, just an absolutely huge catchment area. And I am the only staff member. And so for me, engaging the community is about, yes, we're a coalition, so it's about building coalition. It's about growing our capacity so that I can work with a community, say Durham, and then get them to create sort of a grassroots base of people who will carry on my work whether or not I'm here as much. Obviously, Durham's a bad example because I live here, so I'd still be here as much, especially when we're all working remotely for the time being. I'm here all the time. But being able to have this grassroots group who carries on this work. And we have a great example from work that we did in 2015 in Berwick. We did a charrette project, and the key to our success there really had nothing to do with the coalition. We didn't do anything particularly different, but they had this great group of people who owned it and were invested and were really there and carried on this project long after we were gone. So they were there before us and they're continuing to be there after us. We went in there and did our thing and influenced what was going to happen. And ultimately it's up to the community. They're the decision makers, they're the residents, they're the voters. It's up to the community to really carry the torch. So, probably most importantly, keeping in mind that everyone has a housing story and that your personal story has power. So, if I was doing a presentation on advocacy, I would have talked more about this. Really being personal and passionate about your housing story is always going to be more compelling when you're engaging people and getting people to come out of their shell. Say if you're doing a focus group or a listening session in small groups, getting people to talk about their housing story and to really get that out of them so that they understand what this housing is and what is workforce housing. It's housing for members of the workforce. It's housing for most of us, for most people who are in this Zoom call right now live in some variation of workforce housing. So everyone has a housing story. This is important because it's important for advocates to understand. It's important for people who are engaging other folks to understand, to, pull that out of them. When I sit down for a key informant interview or I have coffee with a local decision maker, often my icebreaker is something along the lines of, what brought you to this town? Why did you choose Durham? Why did you buy a house here? Whatever their specific scenario is. And it gets people to open up about their personal housing story. They were looking for a house and they found one here and they love the community because of XYZ, or they picked it because they love the school system. Really getting that personal story out of them. And at this point, I would turn your attention to my friends, New Futures. Their mission isn't housing, of course, their mission is health policy, but they're really, really good at advocacy and they're really good at teaching advocacy. They did a webinar a couple weeks ago on the power of the personal story. They have this formula for how to craft and create your personal story. So if you need help sort of writing your personal story or telling your personal story or shaping a story that is compelling, then they're a great resource to turn to. I'll also add, everyone having a housing story is also important because if you remember, your local leaders, so the folks who sit on your council, elected officials, planning board members, they're all volunteers and they're all just regular people in your community. None of them are necessarily, planning experts or anything like that. You don't join the planning board because you're a planning expert. You join the planning board because you care about your community and you have the time and the patience and you want to do that and give back to your community in that way. So keep in mind that the folks who are making the decisions are also people who have housing stories. And so pulling their own personal housing story out is great because it humanizes this issue for them, the folks that ultimately have to make a decision about the zoning ordinance that you're putting forward. So I want to end by, and please drop your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to end by pointing out some great resources and further reading for you. If you want to learn more about engagement, if you want to learn more about the state's housing issue and the regional housing efforts, if you want to learn more about advocacy, these are all sort of great resources for you. So of course you can connect with the Workforce Housing Coalition. I'm happy to talk about housing, all day, any day. There's also, I mentioned cooperative extension. If you want to learn more about community engagement, I did an engagement academy with them. It was a 3-day academy on community engagement. It was really great. All of their academies are really great, but I really loved the Community Engagement Academy. New Hampshire Housing has some great resources. George Regan is a great resource for community engagement and also sort of understanding the human aspect of housing and how to use that strategically. New Hampshire Listens, of course, at Carsey School is a fantastic resource if you want to host something like a listening session. They also do facilitation training, so you can learn how to be a facilitator. I already talked about New Futures. They do great free trainings on advocacy, and they, like I said, they put out a webinar a couple weeks ago. Housing Action New Hampshire, if you're more interested in the state level housing policy. So the housing coalitions do local level policy. Housing Action New Hampshire is there to sort of tackle the state stuff. So there are 4 other housing coalitions now, kind of. Us on the Seacoast, the REDC has sort of started their own advocacy program to fill in the gap there, that little green area from Nashua up until the Workforce Housing Coalition's original catchment area. The Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition is great. Vital Communities has a housing advocacy program that's sort of another coalition, and there's a couple more coalitions that are maybe in the works or considering being in the works. The state used to have more. It used to have 7 or so housing coalitions, and a lot of them have closed. I think most people can relate to it being difficult to run a one-person, nonprofit organization. And then, of course, Plan New Hampshire is also a great resource. They're located in Portsmouth, but they work all over the state of New Hampshire on sort of designing your community and planning for more vibrancy. And housing is certainly part of what they do. And speaking of Plan New Hampshire, they administer the state's Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program. So EMTAG grants are funded by New Hampshire Housing, administered by Plan. The application is on Plan and you can apply anytime. They're open to municipalities who are interested in exploring the expansion of housing affordability, supply, diversity in some way, shape, or form, expanding housing in an area of your community. So it's grants of up to $20,000. There is a 25% cash match, so $25,000 to hire a consultant to specifically look at your zoning. And you'll see I can point to some examples of communities that have used the EMTAG program and had really great results. Exeter is a great example, and their website is still up. I think it's exeterhousingfuture.com or something like that. I can share that in follow up. Rochester's also been through the EMTAG program, as has Jackson, New Hampshire. And they've all had great results from working with a consultant, and there's a lot of community engagement embedded in this program. In fact, it's a requirement of the program that community engagement be part of the process. So some other more readings too, and I can share the slides so that you can click on any of these. These is mostly stuff about sort of housing messaging and how do we talk about housing, but also about doing some advocacy and why doing advocacy work is so important at the local level. So I won't spend too much time on that. If you do want a really brief synopsis of some great solutions, I can't recommend this article by Strong Towns enough, 8 things your town can do to add more housing. And that's me, and that's my contact info. So you're free to reach out at any time, and I'm happy to take questions now. I'll stop screen sharing. We can take a peek at the questions.
Yeah, we've got a few here. I think the first is just kind of a more sort of technical background question. When you were talking earlier about what constitutes affordable or workforce housing in the state. Paul had a question here. When we're talking about 100% affordable of the median income, are we considering that on a per person or a household basis?
So the numbers come out from New Hampshire Housing every year. It's sort of looking at, and I can pull that up if we need to. They just came out, so I don't have the numbers memorized yet. So it's structured as rental for a household of 3 and for sale for a household of 4. But in terms of the workforce housing law and how we apply that realistically, it doesn't really matter because those numbers are only meant to be guides to help us sort of gauge what the workforce can afford. So the numbers themselves are derived from a household of 4 for the for sale side and a household of 3 for the rental side to answer that question. But it's really only meant to be a guide. And the spirit of the law is this is approximately what the workforce makes. this is approximately what the workforce can afford. So this is approximately what we can be shooting for.
Gotcha. Thank you. And we had another question about the slides being available. You just mentioned that. We can post those on the Carsey Coffee and Conversations website.
Yeah, and I'd love to
this.
throw in this fact sheet too into that mix.
We would love to post that as well. Kelly had a question here. Can you speak to the importance of connecting a personal story to a system story, and the importance of not reinforcing the personal responsibility default when talking about the need to improve systems?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sure I'm not an expert on this specifically. Making sure that we understand that it's not a personal responsibility thing, but it's the system. And so in housing, I talk a lot about what zoning allows. And so it really is policy that's dictating what we're allowing. And so, say, for example, why can't someone live in a, trendy tiny house on wheels? Why can't someone live in a house that they want to live in? Why can't someone who lives in a giant house be able to turn their house into a duplex? So it is sort of zoning dictating what we're able to do. But you're right that it's not an individual responsibility thing, and I'm not sure that I really know how to answer that question and make sure that that's not what's coming across. Is that when you're telling these personal stories, you're talking about the essential members of our community not having a place to be able to live, and it's people that we really need to be able to live in our community. It's people, these are parts of it we talk a lot about. And again, it's really weird talking about this in the middle of a pandemic where sort of our old stories about the economy and economic development just kind of don't resonate the same way anymore, and they may not for a long time. Because often we're talking about workforce housing in terms of workforce shortages, that employers are having a hard time finding workers, and there's huge, massive workforce shortages in lots of places. And so I know, say, a company in Portsmouth that's busing folks up from Lawrence, Mass every day because they can't find enough employees here. And these are people who are not making tiny paychecks, this is good paying, manufacturing jobs. And I think right now the message that resonates most is thinking about like Dartmouth Hitchcock is an employer that's having a really hard time staffing. And right now, in the midst of a pandemic, that seems more important than it ever has. That they were already short staffed before this started, and now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and they equate a lot of this to the housing shortages in the area. And that makes sense and really speaks to that these are folks that we need in our communities, and the type of people who live in workforce housing and the people who we are trying to serve are folks that you really don't want to have workforce shortages. You don't want to have shortages of, because we're talking about like police officers and healthcare workers, and these are people that we really need. So, but again, I don't know that I really know how to answer that question, so I don't think I really did, but it's a really good question.
Yeah, I'm hearing that, like, connecting the personal with the systemic and not really being able to ignore either piece when you're doing community engagement work, and then using that to inform ultimately the policies that are made. Let's see, we have another question here. Carsey's sending out the list of resources and articles. Yes, we will absolutely attach all that on the Coffee and Conversations webpage. If you search carsey.unh.edu, we will be able to share that with you, all those resources. Ben Frost, former Coffee and Conversations presenter. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Ben.
Says, great presentation. Can you talk a little more, Sarah, about how local housing advocates can be ready for the 11th hour NIMBY attacks on zoning or development proposals? Says, I've seen this happen many times. It's very disheartening. It can be.
Yeah. I mean, the most important thing is, so recognizing, one, you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. So please don't wait until XYZ happens to start advocating. You are all ready to be an advocate right now. I actually did a webinar a couple weeks ago on advocacy and advocacy strategies called YIMBY Academy. That's part of our greater work of training YIMBYs to get out there and be YIMBYs and use their YIMBY voices. And in the 11th hour is not the ideal time to use those skills, but is definitely incredibly important. I will say the most important thing that I can see is folks showing up to be the supportive voice in the room. So I have this story that I am not proud of a time that I voted against what I felt because I caved to, the NIMBYs just sort of wore us down and exhausted us into voting their way. And it was 11 p.m. maybe. I, have a full-time job among other commitments. I was at a planning board meeting. I was exhausted. I think a lot of us were in that vote. We weren't super passionate about this zoning ordinance that was on the table. We didn't love it. Lots of us didn't. And we sort of got bullied into passing it. And that honestly happens. And it would have taken maybe one YIMBY, a couple of YIMBYs in the room to say, to be supportive and to re-energize the planning board, to not make them feel like they were sort of being attacked. And that's just such a common thing that happens. And so going out and showing up at public hearings is incredibly important. Going up and showing up and being the positive voice in the room can be just way more powerful than any of us give it credit for.
So you got another question here. So from Christian, if you are seeing zoning ordinance changes originate in the town council and then go to planning board, then back to the town council, should YIMBYs start advocating with the town council then?
Yeah, I highly recommend starting with your counselors first. If you're in a council style of government, ultimately they have sort of the final say, and often they don't have an opportunity for like public comments, public hearings. Sometimes they do, but if you start by building a relationship, so this is what I did in Durham, and I think I know who the question asker was, so it's a very sort of similar style of government. What I started doing in Durham was building a relationship with all of the town councilors first. So I went and had coffee with a few of them individually and, give a presentation to the town council, and then went and worked with the planning board, where in the planning board, you're gonna have some great public hearing opportunities. You're gonna have a chance to show up at the public hearing and sort of give your input. But yes, start with the council because it's going to be different. There's lots of like 91A things that come in here to sort of the right to know stuff at local level, where it's going to be different to operate with the planning board, where you're going to have a lot more leeway to sort of engage and connect with your counselors before it gets there. Yeah, so start with your counselors first or your select board members first, have coffee with them, start to build a relationship so that they see you as a resource and so that they understand why this is important to you, and then go to your planning board and speak at public hearing and submit letters and talk about the zoning ordinance with planning board members.
Great. Let's see. Kelly mentioning here, the Frameworks Institute has developed some tools about the system story, and we'll be sure to share that along with the other resources that you've provided.
Please do. We love Frameworks Institute. They have their whole toolkit on messaging. I can't remember what it's called, but it was the follow-up to You Don't Have to Live Here and other messages that don't work for housing. Yeah, they're a great resource for housing messaging.
Awesome. So feel free, people, to keep posting questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. Here we go. Friends Forever, do you have any recommendations for staying engaged locally while we're all focused on the physical distancing?
I wish I did. These past few weeks have been hard on a lot of people, and definitely myself included, where I felt maybe a little bit lost. I feel very grateful that we've been able to take advantage of some technology, like being able to do Zoom meetings where we're connecting with people. So a couple weeks ago, we hosted a sort of a housing happy hour that was just meant to be like a hangout on Zoom, and it was really great. And we had a great conversation, and some town councilors showed up. So there were some decision makers there that we were able to connect with, even, virtually from a distance. And certainly we've shifted our programming to webinar based for exactly that reason. We had some events that we had to cancel, and we've been doing webinars as a result. But I don't have any amazing advice on this. And I think maybe I will eventually. Even something like I was thinking about, I contribute to Stay Work Play has a blog on their website, and I write the housing section of it. And even coming up what to write there is tricky because the biggest problem is really that everybody's distracted. So even if you wrote your, best housing letter to the editor ever, it might not have the same impact right now that it would have pre-pandemic because folks are distracted and they're thinking about other things. So it's a really great question. I'd love to hear other people's advice on that.
So while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, I have one. What do you like most, and what is most fulfilling about doing kind of community engagement work in particular, and what parts of it, are a little bit of a grind that folks getting into this work should be thinking about, and uh, you know, it's something you got to deal with, but you get through it to the good part.
Yeah, I love community engagement work. It'd be hard to pick just one thing, like being able to talk to members of the community and get to know them and sort of build a relationship with them. It's been particularly fun in a community where I also live, that now I have these relationships with people. And yes, like our relationship started because I wanted to talk to them about housing in this community. But there's something so sort of personal about housing that I feel like I have a conversation with somebody about housing and we talk about their housing story and what they're struggling with and what they're up against, that I end up sort of just having a nice relationship with them, and it feels like we know each other, and that's just awesome. And community engagement is all, and advocacy too is all about relationship building, so I love that part. I love being able to talk to people. I think certainly dealing with the opposition is not always easy. And I don't think that the, NIMBYs at all come from a place of, I don't think they come from like a bad place or a place of bad intentions, but certainly they come with fear and maybe some confusion and maybe a little bit of ignorance about the issue. But being up against that is really hard, particularly when people are saying things in a public realm and you don't have an opportunity to defend yourself. And that's part of what was so infuriating about this Facebook page in a community that we worked with, is that it's one thing if you come to the public hearing or come to the listening session or come to the event and participate in this charrette process. But if you don't participate in that process at all, and then, in the 11th hour start spreading this false narrative, this negative narrative, it's it's upsetting. That's definitely the hard part. The other thing that we struggle with a lot is, I don't want to say feeling guilty, but maybe feeling a little bit guilty about not being able to reach everyone. And as hard as we in community engagement, people who do engagement work try, it's just there are people who are impossible to reach. And, no amount of surveys or poster boards or whatever are going to get input from everybody in the community. But it often feels like the people that we most need to hear from are the people that we're not hearing from, and there just isn't a great way to bridge that. And as hard as we all try to bridge that. That was a great question.
Yeah, thank you. We also have a comment from Ben here about what we're doing in this pandemic time. But given that communities are now doing Zoom public meetings, and he says that he chaired a public hearing for a subdivision application in Warner on Monday. It was approved. This state of emergency is actually providing greater opportunity for people to be involved. He says, keep an eye on your town's website for public notices of online meetings. And that's very true. I know here at the Carsey School, we've moved everything online, and it is challenging in some ways to not be involved in person, but it also does lead to opportunities for more folks to get involved. I mean, if you don't have to drive somewhere, you can just stay right where you're at and participate to the extent possible.
It's a great point. I was thinking about that when I was in my planning board meeting. We moved our planning board meetings to Zoom, and I was thinking how easy it is now for people to, you can just set it up on your computer, and then, you can make dinner and, hang out with your family and whatever, and listen for the thing that is your thing. You don't have to waste your entire night sitting at the town hall. That's a really great point. I am disappointed in the communities who have decided that, maybe they don't have the technology to do it. So they've just decided to cancel all planning board meetings or cancel whatever meetings until after the pandemic. And there are some communities who went in that direction instead of shifting to Zoom, and that's a bummer. So yeah, that's a great point, Ben.
Awesome. Well, I think we're we're reaching the end here. We've got a couple more minutes if anyone wants to submit any final questions. If not, I will just, kind of close up and say, first of all, thank you, Sarah. This has been excellent.
Thank you. No, thank you.
From Will, the RSA, I believe, states that communities should strive to achieve a percentage of housing to be workforce housing. Are there any penalties if a town doesn't meet these goals?
Certainly, there's always the looming threat of lawsuit if a community is not in compliance with the workforce housing law. Right now, the way that, and talk to Ben Frost about this. I didn't realize he was here. He's really the expert on this, and so he's the best person to talk to about the workforce housing law and the legal part of it. But my understanding is that the way that this is enforced as of right now, until the Housing Appeals Board starts up including when the Housing Appeals Board starts up in July, that it's a developer can sue your community for, not approving a project that really should have been approved if, your community is not in compliance with the workforce housing law and doesn't have an adequate supply of workforce housing. That's the big thing.
Thank you. And has the creation of the appeals board changed much in that direction, or much of the work?
Not yet, not in a good direction anyway. So the Housing Appeals Board did pass in the legislative session last. There were some repeal bills coming up against it. And so for those of you who haven't heard of it or aren't familiar with this, the Housing Appeals Board is basically a speedier, cheaper alternative to court. So in terms of, it doesn't have any impact on local control. It's really the same thing as taking a case to the Superior Court, except now you get to choose this very specific housing court. So the folks who are ruling on each of these cases are now, have some housing expertise, which is great. It's going to be cheaper for the developer, cheaper for the community, and also faster. So you're able to make these decisions more quickly. So that's what the Housing Appeals Board is. It's very similar to the Tax Appeal Board. I really should remember what it's called. So there was some repeal bills against the Housing Appeals Board in this last legislative session. They all, died on the floor, and so the Housing Appeals Board is going to be active this July 1st. So there will be a Housing Appeals Board, and we'll see if that has any sort of impact overall. Certainly, I think that I'm hearing from communities who are scared of it. I think that that's fair. I think that if you are afraid of the Housing Appeals Board, then it's probably time to call your Workforce Housing Coalition or call New Hampshire Housing and fix your zoning so that you're not at risk of being sued or not at risk of losing, that lawsuit when that does happen. So we're happy to help.
Thank you. So some clarification from Ben Frost here. The Housing Appeals Board is based on the Board of Tax and Land Appeals. So
thanks,
very
Ben.
Close. And then he's also saying here, no penalties for a community's failure to comply with the workforce housing law. No workforce housing police exist.
Right.
And the Housing Appeals Board, same thing as what you were saying, will take effect July 1st. Supreme Court is now vetting potential board members. So.
Thank you, Ben. I knew you were cringing when I couldn't think of the tax whatever board.
This is what we lose a little bit in the online format. Typically, we kind of have a more back and forth.
It's so true. Person. It's way more pressure on me to be the expert, though, because ordinarily I could just be like, "Oh, Ben's right there. Ask him."
We're all working together here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending. As we mentioned, we're going to make the slides and resources available at the CARSI website. If you're interested in more community engagement events, I think you can see in the chat bar our digital marketing specialist, Nick. He has posted a few links to when some of the next events are, where you can go to find some of this information that will be posted by the end of the day today. And I think that's about it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
We are so proud of you at CARSI. We love the work you're doing. Thank you for taking some time out of your morning to talk about community engagement with us.
Absolutely. I owe a lot to Carsey. For anybody who doesn't know this backstory, the only reason that I landed this job was because I took an internship. So the Carsey School required that I have an internship, and I was very sort of grouchy and bitter at it at the time because I was having such a hard time finding a paid internship. So I took an unpaid internship with the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. And when in the middle of my internship, when my predecessor decided to resign, I thought, well, I'm here, I'll do it. And here we are 3 years later or so. So thank you, Carsey School.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. The next Coffee and Conversations will also be online, given the uncertain situation, certainly at least into the next month. It will be May 13th. It'll be with Will Stewart, the Executive Director of Stay Work Play. It should be very good, not to be missed. So we'll hope to see you all then. And with that, we'll bid you adieu. Thanks everyone. Thanks Sarah. Bye everyone.